The crew was caught, red-handed in an attempt to run away. 5 young men prepared to risk it all for freedom were now tied, strapped to a horse, and being carried off to jail by law enforcement. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Mr. Frederick Douglass tells us in his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, that upon passing through each neighborhood, everybody we met knew the cause of our arrest, and were out, awaiting our passing by to feast their vindictive eyes on our misery and to gloat over our ruin, as if to say, this is what you get for going against the social order. He writes, "Some said I ought to be hanged, and others I ought to be burnt. Others I ought to have the hide taken from my back for trying to gain freedom." Think about the ideas and beliefs that occupied these people's minds, for them to think that whipping, hanging, and burning people were justifiable punishments for people running away from slavery. Think about it, because it's the ideas, beliefs, and desires within their inner worlds that created these outer responses. Mr. Douglass says, "While no one gave us a kind word or sympathizing look, except the poor slaves who were lifting their heavy hoes and who cautiously glanced at us through the post and rail fences behind which they were at work. Those were the only people from those other neighborhoods and other plantations that felt some type of pity. They knew what was likely to come, and also that this could be themselves if they tried to escape. Our sufferings that morning can be more easily imagined than described. Our hopes were all blasted at a blow. The cruel injustice, the victorious crime, and the helplessness of innocence led me to ask, in my ignorance and weakness, where now is the God of justice and mercy?" Which makes sense to ask. "And why have these wicked men the power thus to trample upon our rights and to insult our feelings?" And yet, in the next moment, came the consoling thought, the day of oppressor will come at last. That's the word of the Lord that came to console him. The intuitive self speaking out to reassure the conscious self in the time of distress. Understand, while the constables were looking forward, Henry and I, being fastened together, could occasionally exchange a word without being observed by the kidnappers who had us in charge.
"What shall I do with my pass?"
said Henry. "Eat it with your biscuit," said I. "It won't do to tear it up." On reaching St. Michael's, we underwent a sort of examination at my master's store, and it was evident to my mind that Master Thomas suspected the truthfulness of the evidence upon which they had acted in arresting us, and that he only affected to some extent the positiveness with which he asserted our guilt. Meaning Master Thomas wasn't fully convinced by the evidence of this accusation, but he affected or acted in part like he really believed that they were guilty. In other words, Thomas wanted them to be guilty, although the evidence was weak, and Mr. Douglass could tell he was forcing his belief and putting on a front. There was nothing said by any of our company which could in any manner prejudice our cause, and there was hope yet that we should be able to return to our homes, if for nothing else, at least to find out the guilty man or woman who had betrayed us, which must have been an inside job. But who was the betrayer? To this end, we all denied that we had been guilty of intended flight. Master Thomas said that the evidence he had of our intention to run away was strong enough to hang us in a case of murder. Yeah, right. Thomas is pump faking and trying to get a confession. But, said I, the cases are not equal. If murder were committed, someone must have committed it. The thing is done. In our case, nothing has been done. We have not run away. Where is the evidence against us? Nobody ran. They didn't find the Baltimore passes, and nothing had been done. So where's all this strong evidence? It didn't exist. But from something which dropped in the course of the talk, it appeared that there was but one witness against us, and that witness could not be produced. Somebody had been telling, but Master Thomas would not tell who it was. Master Thomas would not tell us who his informant was, but we suspected and suspected one person only. Who was it? Several circumstances seemed to point Sandy out as our betrayer. Oh, snaps, they thought Sandy told, and here's why. His entire knowledge of our plans, his participation in them, his withdrawal from us. Remember, Sandy was the only one that dropped out, and all the other men stood firm. His dream and his simultaneous presentiment that we were betrayed. The taking us and the leaving him
were calculated to turn suspicion toward him.
Uh-oh.
And yet, we could not suspect him.
But they still didn't blame him, although the circumstantial evidence looked like he was the betrayer. But they didn't put it on him. Why not?
We all loved him too well to think it possible that he could have betrayed us. So we rolled the guilt on other shoulders.
Nobody knows who told, but somebody for sure told, because Master Thomas nor the law enforcement had magical powers that allowed them to listen into conversations they were not present for. So one of the slaves took the message and let it be known. And because of that, they were tied to a horse and dragged 15 miles by foot to Easton Jail. Mr. Douglass says,
"In jail, we were placed under the care of Mr. Joseph Graham, the sheriff of the county. Henry and John and myself were placed in one room, and Henry Bailey and Charles Roberts in another by themselves. This separation was intended to deprive us of the advantage of concert and to prevent trouble in jail."
And after being situated within the jail, guess who he saw there? The slave catchers, who could not wait to catch them in N-word. They came to the jail to see if they could bargain with owners for runaways, and then sell them to other plantation owners. These people could care less about people's feelings or how it made the family feel when they sell their mothers, the fathers, sisters, or brothers, or anything like that regarding Negroes. They were purely driven by financial incentives. So catching an N-word was just another part of the job, and jail was another place for them to get one.
Such a set of debased and villainous creatures I never saw before, and hope never to see again. I felt myself surrounded as by a pack of fiends, fresh from perdition. They laughed, leered, and grinned at us, saying,
"Ah, boys, we've got you, haven't we? So you were about to make your escape. Where were you going to?"
After taunting us and peering at us as long as they liked, they one by one subjected us to an examination with a view to ascertain our value, feeling our arms and legs and shaking us by the shoulders to see if we were sound and healthy, impudently asking us how we would like to have them for masters. To such questions we were, very much to their annoyance, quite dumb, disdaining to answer them. For one, I detested the whiskey-bloated gamblers in human flesh, and I believe I was as much detested by them in turn. One fellow told me, if he had me, he would cut the devil out of me pretty quick. Soon after the holidays were over, contrary to all our expectations, Messrs. Hamilton and Freeland came up to Easton, not to make a bargain with the Georgia traders, nor to send us up to Austin Woldfolk, as is usual in the case of runaway slaves, but to release Charles, Henry Harris, Henry Bailey, and John Harris from prison, and this too without the infliction of a single blow. I was now left entirely alone in prison, felt glad that they were leased from prison, and from the dread prospect of a life, or death I should rather say, in the rice swamps,
which is in the far or deep South, where they endure extreme hard bondage by working on the sugar plantation, picking cotton, and working outside all day in the hot sun. That was the usual punishment for committing a runaway offense. But these four caught a break, and Mr. Douglass was glad they did not get sent down there to die.
It is due to the noble Henry to say that he seemed almost as reluctant to leave the prison with me in it as he was to be tied and dragged to prison. But he and the rest knew that we should, in all the likelihoods of the case, be separated in the event of being sold, and since we were now completely in the hands of our owners, we all concluded it would be best to go peaceably home.
Every one of the members went back home except Mr. Douglass. In the prison cell alone, he began to feel a life of misery. The other men went back home with their owners, but what about him? What was his fate in the matter? He says,
"I had hoped and expected much for months before, but my hopes and expectations were now withered and blasted. The ever-dreaded slave life in Georgia, Louisiana, and Alabama, from which escape is next to impossible now in my loneliness, stared me in the face."
The dreaded Deep South. Is this where he might be headed?
The possibility of ever becoming anything but an abject slave, a mere machine in the hands of an owner, had now fled, and it seemed to me it had fled forever. A life of living death, beset with the innumerable horrors of the cotton field and the sugar plantation, seemed to be my doom.
Uh-oh, I know that's all he could think about in that jail cell. The dreaded life of picking cotton in the deep South.
After remaining in this life of misery and despair about a week, which, by the way, seemed a month, Master Thomas, very much to my surprise and greatly to my relief, came to the prison and took me out, for the purpose, as he said, of sending me to Alabama with a friend of his who would emancipate me at the end of 8 years.
He's getting ready to go deeper down into the dungeon for 8 years, then become free. Was that a good deal? Or what do you think?
I was glad enough to get out of prison, but I had no faith in the story that this friend of Captain Auld would emancipate me at the end of the time indicated.
Why not? Because many slave owners made false promises to free their slaves after a certain period, but they somehow found reason to keep extending their enslavement. And that's because they never intended to free them in the beginning. They used these psychological mind games to gain trust with the slaves, to give them hope and to get them to work harder, since the slaves felt that they were working towards something if they did a good job and stayed loyal. This is why Mr. Douglass does not believe Thomas's bargain. Here we go.
Besides, I never had heard of his having a friend in Alabama, and I took the announcement simply as an easy and comfortable method of shipping me off to the far South.
Give him a little hope so shipping him down there won't be such a fight on his way further down into the pit.
He certainly did not exhaust his power upon me in the case, but acted upon the whole very generously, considering the nature of my offense. He had the power and the provocation to send me, without reserve, into the very Everglades of Florida, beyond the remotest hope of emancipation.
And Florida is so far from the north that just by looking at it on the map, you start to lose hope. The Everglades are the furthest south that you can get in Florida, so being sent there felt beyond any sense of hope of getting free to Mr. Douglass. And this is where Thomas could have sent him.
And his refusal to exercise that power must be set down to his credit. After lingering about St. Michael's a few days, and no friend from Alabama making his appearance to take me there, Master Thomas decided to send me back again to Baltimore to live with his brother Hugh, with whom he was now at peace.
Remember, Brother Hugh and Thomas got into a conflict over the disabled slave girl. Thomas sent the disabled girl to live with Hugh in Baltimore, but his brother Hugh sent her back because they didn't have any need for her. Thomas became upset with his brother for doing that because he felt like he was being ungrateful. And when Hugh sent the girl back, Thomas also made him send Frederick back as well. This was their issue, but they eventually resolved it. And now Thomas wants to send Mr. Douglass back to his brother Hugh's house in Baltimore. Here we go.
Possibly he became so by his profession of religion at the camp meeting in the Bayside. Master Thomas told me that he wished me to go to Baltimore and learn a trade, and that if I behaved myself properly, he would emancipate me at 25.
Is that a deal? He was about 17 at this point, so the deal is to go to Baltimore, behave, learn a trade, and then after 8 years, when he turned 25, Thomas claims that he would set him free. What do you think? Should he take his word on this? Let's see what he says.
Thanks for this one beam of hope in the future. The promise had but one fault. It seemed too good to be true.
And anything that seems too good to be true probably is. So what is Mr. Douglass going to do about it? How is he going to navigate his way in this new circumstance? Are ideas of escape still occupying a large portion of his mind? If so, how is he going to escape this time without his crew? We're just going to have to see as we continue. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.